A man traveled 15,000 miles to reach Oregon. He rounded Cape Horn, where storms could trap a ship in violent seas for weeks, and where men vanished into black water without a sound. He helped build a government where none had existed, and less than a year later, he was stabbed to death in the street. His name was George LeBreton, and almost no one remembers him. When George LeBreton arrived in Oregon, there was no government, no court, no governor. Britain claimed it. America claimed it. In the Willamette Valley, neither enforced it. Then a man died, a prominent settler. Livestock, mills, land worth thousands, but no will, no court to settle it. And suddenly the question could not be avoided. Who governs this place? The answer would fall, unexpectedly, to George LeBreton. Born in Massachusetts in 1810, he had sailed 15,000 miles around Cape Horn. He reached Oregon in 1840 and stayed. He was not powerful or wealthy, but he could write. On a frontier where many men signed with an X, that mattered. So the settlers chose him. 31 years old, pen in hand, he wrote names and claims and turned them into law. The paper was ordinary. What set in motion was not. On April 15th, 1841, George LeBreton wrote and signed this document. It remains a fragment of the probate court, Oregon's first deliberate step toward organized self-government. For the first time, settlers acted as one body. They settled an estate. They claimed authority. It proved something larger. They were capable of governing themselves. The question was no longer whether they could, but who that government would protect and who would leave out. Here you'll find true stories from the Oregon Trail and early settlers, with details often missing from the historical record. If you find this worthwhile, please subscribe and like this video. Joining the channel helps support future work, and comments help guide what comes next. The valley was divided by faith, by culture, by loyalty. American missionaries wanted American law. French-Canadian settlers, tied to the Hudson's Bay Company, resisted. Catholic clergy worried about losing influence. George LeBreton had already recorded the first probate court. One man's estate, settled on paper. But that alone could not hold the valley together. More settlers arrived. New cabins went up. Prairie was plowed and fenced. Land claims began to overlap. This agreement was no longer theoretical. It was over land, over law, over who held power. By 1843, doing nothing was no longer an option. The question was no longer whether to form a government. It was who would control it, and whether George LeBreton could turn words into law. On May 2nd, 1843, settlers gathered at Champoeg, not in a Capitol building, not a courtroom, just a clearing along the Willamette River. At the time, Oregon was enormous. It included present-day Washington and Idaho, parts of Montana and Wyoming, and even land now in British Columbia. What happened here would shape the entire Northwest. Champoeg was little more than a landing on French prairie. A warehouse by the river, trails converging, boats tied up along the shore. For generations, this had been Kalapuya land. The river had always been a highway. Now, settlers had to decide, would they form a provisional government? George LeBreton, 32, ink and paper in hand, began the record. The debate grew heated. Voices rose. Arguments tangled. An earlier motion had failed. Confusion spread. Some wanted American law. Others feared it. The meeting teetered. George LeBreton called for a division account. Then Joseph Meek stepped forward. A former mountain man and fur trapper. Broad-shouldered, loud, used to danger. Meek did not speak gently. He thundered the question, who's for a divide? Then he called out for all who wanted a government to follow him. The move was sudden. Electric. Men stepped to either side. George LeBreton counted. 52. 50. 2 votes tipped the balance. At Joseph Meek's call for 3 cheers for our side, a shout rose across Champoeg, louder than it had ever heard, and louder than it ever would again. George LeBreton wrote the decision into the record. No nation had sanctioned it. No army stood behind it. But in that valley, on that day, it became law. Law born of 52 votes is fragile. It survives only as long as people accept it. In Oregon, that acceptance was uncertain. The new government had no army, no prison, no history to command respect. Only paper, only belief. And that belief would soon be tested. By a promise, by a horse, by 3 men. In 1843, a broken promise set 3 men on a collision course. One of them was James Saules. By the time James Saules reached Oregon, he had already crossed more water than most men in the valley had ever seen. Born around 1806 in the Upper South, likely North Carolina or Virginia, James Saules grew up in a country divided by race and law. He left early, went to sea, kept moving. In 1841, James Saules arrived in Oregon aboard the USS Peacock, part of the United States exploring expedition sent to chart the Pacific and extend American reach. He did not arrive quietly. In July 1841, attempting to cross the shifting sandbars where the Columbia River meets the Pacific, the USS Peacock struck bottom. Waves pounded the hull. Timbers split. The ship broke apart in the surf. All 133 crew members survived. They built a rough camp near Fort George and called it Peacockville, after their wrecked ship, the USS Peacock. Canvas shelters, driftwood fires, wreckage scattered along the shore. Within months, most of the expedition sailed away. James Saules did not. He remained in Oregon. He married a Chinook woman, lived near Cape Disappointment, where the Columbia River meets the Pacific, becoming the first known black settler at that river's edge. By 1845, James Saules moved south into the Willamette Valley with his family. James Saules was not only a sailor, he was a cook, and he was a fiddler. At gatherings, people noticed him. James Saules was visible, talented, known, in a divided valley that could be dangerous. And James Saules was not a man who went unnoticed. The second man was Cockstock. He belonged to the Molalla, a native people of the wooded Cascade foothills along the eastern edge of the Willamette Valley. They moved with the seasons, hunted the ridgelines, and traded along the rivers long before settlers divided the land into fences and claims. Cockstock was sometimes misidentified as Wasco, though it was his wife who was Wasco, a native people from the south bank of the Columbia River in north-central Oregon. No last name appears for him in the historical record. He is known simply as Cockstock, likely a name given to him or one he adopted in dealings with settlers. By the 1840s, his world was changing. Disease had already cut deep. Settlers were marking boundaries. Missionaries were calling their order civilization. A relative of Cockstock's had been flogged by Elijah White, the United States Indian agent, after breaking into a missionary's home at the Wascapam Mission. Elijah White claimed legal authority. Cockstock did not recognize it. To settlers, Elijah White represented stability, American structure in disputed land. To many Native people, he represented intrusion, punishment under foreign rules, power without consent. Cockstock spoke openly against him, against the beatings, against the right of outsiders to judge Molalla people. By the early 1840s, tension lay beneath daily life like a fault line. Meetings were strained. Rumors traveled faster than truth. Every insult carried history. In that atmosphere, even a small grievance could swell. And soon, A dispute over a horse would carry far more than its price. The third man was Winslow Anderson. He was the first known black settler in Oregon who came intending to stay. Born in Boston, Winslow Anderson became a sailor at a young age. By his 20s, he had crossed oceans as a merchant sailor and worked as a fur trapper. Winslow Anderson was certified as a seaman by 1833, a skilled man in a dangerous trade. In 1834, Winslow Anderson entered the Oregon country with a party of 19. On the way north through California, at the time part of Mexico, they drove nearly 200 cattle and horses over long, grueling miles. Armed men contested ground. This was not a drifter. This was a man who knew risk. Winslow Anderson settled on French prairie with French-Canadian trappers and native families, a mixed heritage community later known as the Métis. He married a native woman, worked on the missions, supervised laborers, practiced medicine when no doctor was near. He was the kind of man others relied on, even if they did not always say so. By 1840, Winslow Anderson was established, experienced, respected, and not easily intimidated. He had survived oceans, wilderness, and the shifting politics of the valley. Soon, he would face something closer, a dispute over a horse. That would end in blood and bind his name forever to the death of George LeBreton. James Saules, Cockstock, Winslow Anderson, 3 men on a collision course. And at the center, whether he wanted it or not, stood George LeBreton. He had written law into existence. But on the frontier, paper could not keep the peace. Cockstock had worked on Winslow Anderson's farm. A horse had been promised for his labor. When the work ended, the horse was gone. Winslow Anderson had sold it to James Saules. To settlers, it was a sale. To Cockstock, it was a broken promise. He demanded the horse. He issued threats. On February 17th, 1844, James Saules wrote to Indian agent Elijah White. James Saules said he feared for his life. He accused Cockstock of harassing settlers, even of murder. The next day, Elijah White led a party toward the Willamette Falls to seize him. Cockstock was gone. A $100 warrant was issued. Rumors moved faster than writers. One account claimed multiple killings. Another, recorded by Archbishop Francois Blanchet, described only a single death. Truth narrowed. Stories widened. Fear did the rest. And the fragile government George LeBreton had written into being was about to be tested in the streets of Oregon City. Elijah White, the United States Indian agent, had tried twice to capture Cockstock in late February and early March 1844. Both attempts failed. On March 4th, Cockstock returned to Oregon City, this time with 5 companions. It was a show of force. He demanded to know why settlers were after him. A crowd gathered. Tension crackled in the air. An onlooker warned, "That Indian is a good man. You should not molest him. If you do, you will repent." But chaos had already taken root. George LeBreton stood at the center. Authority existed on paper, not in his hands. He moved to seize Cockstock. Some in the crowd urged that Cockstock be shot at any risk. Then the shots rang out. In the struggle, Cockstock fired and stabbed George LeBreton. The wound would be fatal, but not immediate. Winslow Anderson stepped in. He swung his rifle. Cockstock's skull shattered. He fell, dead where he stood. Violence spilled into the crowd. Cockstock's companions fired. 2 settlers were shot. 1 died. Then the Molalla fled. In minutes, the valley's political, racial, and cultural tensions erupted into bloodshed. And George LeBreton, the man who had written authority into existence, lay mortally wounded in the street. 3 days later, Reverend Modesty Mayor described the mood of the Willamette Valley settlers to Archbishop Francois Blanchet. Reverend Modesty Mayor wrote that the settlers seemed to admit they had acted too quickly in this unfortunate affair. But the deed was done. It was, he said, a true murder, born of the extremely rash and unjustifiable actions of poor George LeBreton, who would pay dearly for his apostasy and his crime. George LeBreton did not recover. Blood poisoning ended his life. Cockstock's widow was Wasco. Her relatives arrived in force. Over 70 men demanding compensation. Peace held narrowly. Elijah White negotiated 2 blankets, a dress, a handkerchief. News of the violence spread quickly. Rumors followed that native warriors were organizing, that the attack was part of something larger, that settlers were no longer safe. Fear moved faster than facts. Some settlers blamed James Saules and Winslow Anderson, accusing them of stirring unrest or siding with native people. Their lives were threatened. Fear hardened into policy. On May 1st, 1844, Elijah White wrote to U.S. Secretary of War James Madison Porter. Elijah White reported that James Saules was still living near the Columbia with his native wife and family, behaving quietly, for now. But Elijah White warned that James Saules, and in his view, all black settlers, were dangerous. He even asked whether their immigration to Oregon could be prohibited. A fight over a horse had become a question of who could live in Oregon. The valley had chosen self-government. It now had to decide who it would protect and who it would force to leave. The death of George LeBreton did not end the crisis. It deepened it. The government he had written into being now had to stand without him. In July 1844, Peter Burnett, a powerful member of the Provisional Government's Legislative Council, introduced a law titled An Act for the Prevention of Slavery in Oregon. Peter Burnett had shaped much of the young government's early legislation. Now he would shape its racial policy. On paper, the law banned slavery. In practice, it went further. It required free black people to leave Oregon. Those who refused could be whipped, later changed to forced labor, and then deported east. James Saules, already linked to the earlier conflict, moved north of the Columbia River. Beyond that river, the provisional government had no authority. But the message was unmistakable. Black settlers were not welcome. Many black and mixed-race families left. The government George LeBreton had helped create with 52 votes was now drawing lines, not only on paper, but across the land itself. Authority had hardened. What began as fragile compromise now carried consequences in law and in life. A dispute over a horse led to violence. A man's death created fear, and that fear became policy. With George LeBreton gone, the settlers moved to secure themselves. On March 23, 1844, they organized a militia, the Oregon Rangers. Their purpose was direct: to defend Anglo-American settlements along the Willamette River. It was the first organized, non-indigenous armed force in the Pacific Northwest. 2 years later, reports of Wasco men taking cattle near present-day Salem, Oregon, prompted another mobilization. One ranger fired without orders, wounding a Wasco man. The militia later compensated him, but the damage was done. Authority on the frontier was uncertain, even when backed by rifles. By June 1846, after the United States formally claimed Oregon under the Oregon Treaty, the Rangers disbanded. George LeBreton had written authority into existence with 52 votes. In his absence, that authority changed shape. It became written law. It became organized force. It became the power to decide who could remain and who must leave. Champoeg had grown slowly along the Willamette River. Houses, streets, a post office, all marked its presence. But the river always held the final say. In December 1861, warm rain and melting snow swelled the Willamette higher than anyone remembered. On December 5th and 6th, nearly 30 feet of water swept through the town. Buildings lifted, homes vanished, streets dissolved. Nothing remained but sand and stripped earth. Champoeg was never rebuilt. By 1900, even the spot where George LeBreton had counted those votes was nearly impossible to find. The river endures. The town does not. The flood of 1861 swept through the Willamette River, taking lives along its banks. Near present-day Corvallis, a small headstone stands in a quiet corner of Crystal Lake Cemetery. For more than 20 years, someone has left tokens, flowers, beads, bright bracelets. No note, no explanation, just remembrance. The stone reads, Anna George, drowned 1860. But both the name and the year are wrong. Her real name was Annie. She was 11 years, 8 months, and 1 day old. She died in December 1861, along with her siblings, when the skiff carrying her parents, Abel and Elizabeth George, and their children overturned in the rising floodwaters. George LeBreton documented government. A stranger left tokens at a grave. Different acts. Same insistence. Someone was here, and someone remembered them. The buildings are gone. The river has shifted. But the words George LeBreton set down did not wash away. Even after his death, the records remained. Land claims, laws, appointments. The town vanished. The river endured. The papers endured. Oregon feels permanent today. But it began with fragile acts of belief, signatures, votes, records, tokens left at graves. History depended on people who recorded it, preserved it, and refused to let it fade. From the pen of George LeBreton to the quiet remembrance of Annie, the same truth holds. Even the most fragile beginnings endure, if someone takes the time to make them matter. The names on maps are only part of the story. The people behind them, settlers, sailors, native families, children lost to floods, are remembered only if someone chooses to remember. These stories do not survive on their own. They last because someone records them, because someone preserves them, because someone tells them again and again. Subscribe to explore more of Oregon's trail of history. Share your thoughts in the comments. Join the conversation. Every name remembered, every story told, keeps the past alive and helps us understand the fragile beginnings that shaped this land.